Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Happiness Festival. It's my absolute pleasure to be joined with Professor Waldinger for our live Q&A. Robert, if I may, is
Please.
clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here with us.
It's great to be here. It's a wonderful festival.
Thank you. So, Robert, we've just finished watching your talk on what makes life good, and I'm curious how you first envisioned the grant study when you first started working on it. A lot of people don't have the patience with longitudinal data, let alone 75 years of it.
Hmm. Well, I'm the fourth director, so I started working there in 2003. Sometimes when I say that I direct this study, that we're now in our 83rd year, and sometimes when I say that, people look at me like, "You don't look that old." But no, so it's 17 years ago. I started working with the study, and I had heard about it as a medical student years before, and then thought, oh, there's no way I could ever work on something that interesting. So it was such an exciting thing to get the chance to be part of that stream of researchers studying the same people over so many years.
Was it different to how you first studied it in medical school? How exactly was it different?
Well, I brought different methods when I began. So when the study started, there were interviews and then questionnaires every 2 years. And we got medical records from our participants, but that was it. So they had never been audio taped, they'd never been videotaped. Uh, and so when I came, we did both of those things. We drew their blood to get DNA. We scanned their brains. So we brought all the methods that had been developed in the 21st century to bear on these same people, looking at the same questions about what helps people thrive, but bringing in biology and biological measures in addition to the social and psychological measures that had been used so well for so many years.
So, in some senses, you're modernizing the grant study.
Mm,
That's
yeah.
absolutely amazing. And I'll jump to questions from our viewers first instead of hogging the entire Q&A. I'm sure they have a lot of questions to ask you about the good life after your amazing talk. We'll be asking questions live from our YouTube panel, and I'll try my best to answer all the questions on there. But as we're a bit time limited, I'm really sorry if the question was not selected. So, Yuganta, sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, asks, what should be our happiness equation?
Hmm. Uganda, there is no happiness equation. It's different for each person. So there are people who do equations and make formulas and all that, and that's not bad. It's just that our situations uh, are so different and so unique that what we can say is that there are certain basic ingredients that help most people thrive. That's the best we can do rather than some particular formula. And as you know, one of the things our research has found is that one of the most basic ingredients is keeping your relationships good and healthy as you go through life.
Um, Lucas asked something that's really similar to relationships, work. How important is work regarding happiness in the context of new work? What can we learn from the study?
That's a great question. That's a really good question because sometimes we can think that it's a dichotomy that work is not the place where you find happiness and basically your home life is where you get the most out of life. But because we spend so much of our time at work, most of us, each day, it really needs to be a place where we pay attention to our well-being. And so there's now much more interest in helping people cultivate good relationships at work. If you have a friend at work, you are much more likely to consider yourself happy. You're likely to perform better at work. And so what we hope to do is help people think about ways that they can cultivate friendships at work so that you feel that somebody is on your side, that somebody knows a little bit about your life and you know about theirs. So work can play and probably should play an important part in our lives in terms of the well-being that we construct for ourselves.
So, in some sense, could I say that it's about making the best out of the social connections that we have in any situation that we're in?
Yes, certainly what we find is that the people who are the happiest and the healthiest are the people whose connections are good throughout the different areas of their life. So, because you don't want to go to work for 8 hours a day or sometimes more and feel lonely, or feel like you don't matter or nobody cares about you. It's a terrible stress. In fact, there was a famous study in Britain, the Whitehall study, that looked at social servants, people in the hierarchy, and found that um, feeling more of a sense of control over your work life made a big difference in people's health. So, how we set up our lives at work as well as at home is a big determinant of how we do, how healthy we are, and certainly how happy we feel.
So, Alice asked, what do you think about the value of solitude for well-being?
Mm. Alice, thank you for asking that because I'm a Zen practitioner. I have a lot of solitude. I seek solitude because I find it particularly helpful and nourishing to spend time alone. Sometimes it's spending time in nature. Sometimes I will sit and look at a tree for 10 minutes, just sitting there doing nothing but looking at everything I can notice about a tree that's sitting there in front of me. Um, that's one of the ways I find solitude and feel energized by that solitude. It's different from loneliness, and that's important. So solitude is something we seek out and gives back to us. Loneliness is that subjective experience of not being as connected to people as you want to be. But solitude is something that people need more or less of depending on their temperaments. There are some people who hate being alone and who want to be with others all day long. There are other people who really want a lot of alone time, and that's what energizes them and refuels them. So there's no formula for us. Each of us has our own degree of need for solitude, but it's really important to find what that is and find sources of solitude that nourish you.
Something that you mentioned is that you're also a Zen priest, and Miller wanted to know, why did you become a Zen priest? Aren't
Mm.
science and religion incompatible? And does this conflict make you unhappy?
Oh, I love that question because I used to think it would. I was not a particularly spiritual or religious person. And I found that my spiritual practice, my practice of Zen, really helped me to think about my place in the world, what it means to be a human being and to have a life, a brief life in the world. And Zen keeps reminding us that life is short. And so we want to be really careful about what we do with our lives. So I became a Zen priest really as a vow of service. It's a commitment to try to be of help in some ways in the world. So I consider, for example, my research on what helps people thrive as trying to be of service. I consider my talking with people and listening to people and hearing what they need, hearing their wisdom. All of that is a way to try to serve the world. I don't think science and religion are incompatible. I think that some of the stories of religion are not substantiated by science, but science is just one way of knowing about the world. Science is not the only way of knowing about the world. And there are certain questions that science can never answer for us, that only some kind of spiritual practice, some kind of humanistic philosophy can get to. So I don't find them incompatible. They don't make me unhappy. In fact, they're both real sources of happiness for me.
So, would one of these questions that maybe science and religion should come together to answer be how to live a good life? Because what Peter um, asks is that what does living a good life actually mean? Does it mean not doing evil and understanding what in fact is evil, or what would it mean?
Well, it does mean not doing evil. So there are certain commitments that we can make, and of course there are the religious commitments. There's the Ten Commandments in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are vows that we take in Zen Buddhism about not doing evil and doing good. Um, and of course, discerning what is good and what is evil is really difficult sometimes. And so that's a lifelong practice, trying to discern how to turn away from what's evil, how to turn toward what is good. Um, but it's a practice that I find totally worth doing because it's important. And so for me, that's part of living a good life.
So, Jim asks a very interesting question. He says that sometimes I feel guilt for being happy when there is so much suffering in the world. This feeling
Mm,
of guilt moderates my happiness. How can I break the cycle, or should I? And I think this question also is quite relevant to us, especially in the time of COVID.
absolutely. Um, and this is Jim Barber asking this question, who's someone that I know well and admire. And yes, I think many of us feel guilt when we're okay during this pandemic. Feel guilt that we're not the ones who are sick, that we are not the ones who are laid off if we still have work and still have an income. Um, there's no way to avoid some of those feelings that we are better off because we are always better off than some other people in the world. But my sense is that the way to use that is to try when you can not to be weighed down by that feeling of, oh, I'm better off, but to use that as an impetus to help. So, yes, I am not sick. So, how then do I try to use the energy I have being healthy for the betterment of the world? And that's the way I can manage the feeling that I'm better off than other people. It's almost impossible to get away from that feeling. And the important thing is not to make ourselves wrong about it. Not to say, oh, I should be suffering as much as other people. The whole aim of life, as the Dalai Lama tells us, is to be happy. And so the aim is not for me to suffer because other people are suffering. The aim is for me to try to help lift everybody up together.
He also raised another point, which is that is the grant study just in America, if I'm correct? He raised a point is that are there any longitudinal studies of happiness that are taking place in non-Western societies such as China, India, or Africa? And how would changing the different cultural settings and resource constraints change factors and the causes for happiness?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Theo, there are a number of longitudinal studies, but not many in the non-Western societies that you're pointing to. At least not that I know of. There may be now. Um, there's more and more research certainly in China and in other parts of Asia. Uh, in New Zealand, there's a very well-known study called the Dunedin study, which has followed the same people for several decades now. It's a fine study. But New Zealand is arguably much more Western. I mean, certainly there is a Maori population there, and they are also part of that study. But you're pointing to something important, which is that it's many of the countries that have had resources, that have had the luxury of doing longitudinal studies. And, the study that I do started with all men, all Caucasian men. And of course, that is not a representative sample of human life. So we are always trying to broaden our purview. We're always trying to look at what other studies have found. We're trying to see whether the findings that come from our study have been replicated in studies in other parts of the world with other populations. And to a great extent, they have. But let me just say that I appreciate your question, and we need more of these kinds of studies in very different cultures.
So, apart from funding, are there any difficulties that's stopping this from happening?
Yes. Our study is unusual in that it has gone on for so long. So we're in our 83rd year. Most longitudinal studies stop before the 10-year mark. Sometimes it's for lack of funding, but sometimes that's not the problem. Many times, just so many people drop out of a longitudinal study that scientifically it's no longer useful to keep studying people, because the people who drop out are lost, and you don't know whether their experience is similar to the people who have stayed in the study. So our study has had a very low dropout rate. And partly that's thanks to the doggedness of my predecessors. I mean, we would call people up, we would send them birthday cards, we would send them thank you notes when they sent in their questionnaires. And so what we are trying to do is create a sense of community. It's hard to do. We've been lucky, but we've also been persistent. And so my hope is that there will be other longitudinal studies that have researchers with this kind of persistence and have communities that are willing to give. Our study participants have been among the most generous people on the planet because they keep telling us about their lives and they hang in there with us, making this great contribution to science. It's quite unusual.
It's really amazing how the grand study has gone on for such a long time and such a good quality. So, Nala asks, why do you think relationships are so important? Do you think, for example, money, stability, or fame would be important in the long term? People divorce often, but if they have resources, they can always bounce back.
It's a really important question. So what we find is that we all have these basic needs. We need food and clothing and shelter and healthcare. So we need a certain basic income in order to have those things. Actually, our happiness level does depend on having those basic needs met. And when they study this systematically, that's what we find. But then once you get above the level of income where you have those basic needs met, then being richer doesn't really increase your happiness very much. So it's not that money doesn't make a difference, it's that after a certain point, it doesn't make a difference. So the figure that's tossed around a lot in the United States is a family income of $75,000 a year, which is pretty high, actually. But once you get beyond that, happiness doesn't increase very much. As for fame, fame doesn't seem to make people happy. Fame is an odd thing if you think about it. It's a lot of people who don't know you, knowing your name, and often having lots of fantasies about you that aren't true. So The idea of fame is really that fame somehow will make me happier turns out for most people not to be true. Um, which is different from doing things in the world that get attention. If you're doing important things that happen to get attention, that's different. That can make you happy. But what makes you happy is feeling like you're putting something out into the world that matters to you.
So, in a sense, living a meaningful life.
Yeah, that's what we find. That the people who feel best about their lives, particularly as they look back on their lives as they get older, are the people who felt that their activities have had meaning, that they have mattered to some other people in the world, to some causes. Yeah.
Is there any advice to for you to give people who are searching for the meaning in their lives? Because a lot of people would go around not knowing what the end goal of their life is or what they actually want from this life. Would you have
Mm,
any advice for them?
yeah. I think my first bit of advice would be not to worry that you don't know. Um, there's a there's a fantasy that we should be able to map out a clear path for our lives and know what we want and go after it. And there are people who do that, and everything is fine if you do that. There's a great quote from Joseph Campbell, who I admire a lot. He said once, "If the path before you is clear, you're probably on somebody else's path." The idea being that we don't know where life is going to take us. So the advice might be to just check in with yourself now. What matters to me now? Who matters to me now? And can I devote more time to the causes and the people that matter to me now? Those may change over time, but I can at least pay attention to what's important right now and where I can devote my energies.
So, Chris asked a question which is about mindfulness, and he wants to know how mindfulness practice can help our relationships and life fulfillment, and can it actually be scientifically measured?
Ah, yes, mindfulness has been scientifically measured. They've done a lot of research on it now, and as you can imagine, it has all kinds of benefits. It really does. And science has shown that there are tremendous benefits to our emotional well-being, to our physical health, to our functioning with other people, our relationships. So mindfulness, and we think mindfulness does this in many ways. One is by simply getting us to check in with ourselves, to pay attention to what we're feeling and all the sensations that arise in our bodies, to pay attention to what's around us right here in the moment, instead of being lost in the dream of automatic pilot, of just going through life thinking about the past and thinking about the future. That all of that coming back to the present makes us happier, it calms our bodies down, and in that way it keeps us healthier. So Chris, you should go and look out, I'm sure there's a lot you can find now on the internet to look at the scientific evidence for mindfulness practices being of benefit to us.
Jamie has a slightly long two-part question. I hope that's okay. I'll ask the first part before I move on to the next. So Jamie wants to know, did people who have good relationships possess positive examples to learn from in childhood? Or are there also cases where their childhood relationships were terrible, for example, in broken families, long-term parental abuse, or neglect due to substance abuse, or gambling and psychiatric conditions, etc., etc.? Go on to also eventually have good relationships in adulthood.
Mm. So the answer to all of that is yes. So um, having good role models in childhood is such a help. It's such a great foundation. If you have role models of people who deal with each other decently and with respect, and who work out conflicts with each other in a way that everybody ends up feeling basically okay. That those models are hugely important in setting the stage for you to be able to have those kinds of relationships when you get to adulthood. So that's a great foundation. But what if you don't have that foundation? Many people come from homes where there's tremendous fighting, where there's abuse, where there's domestic violence. They are in schools where there's bullying. Um, what do you do then? Well, what we know is that there are ways to heal that. That finding good relationships in adulthood really can make a difference, really can help us to learn better ways of managing, um, and better ways of being with other people. So, there's a lot of teaching now of what's called socio-emotional learning in schools, where we teach children, these are what feelings are. This is what happens when you get angry, and this is a way to deal with anger when you're angry at your friend. Or, there are all these educational programs now that help people learn, because we don't take for granted that they learn everything at home. Um, and what we find is that kids do lots better. There's less bullying, there's less unhappiness, less anxiety among children, and they grow up into happier adults. And then what we find is that as adults, there are ways to learn these things as well, often by finding friends who provide better models for dealing with conflicts, with dealing with negative feelings. Sometimes therapy, good psychotherapy, can really help when you're struggling with the legacy of a difficult childhood. So there are a lot of ways to heal some of the early wounds that many of us have.
I think her next question is something very related to what you just said. He wants to know what factors that are purely within the participant's control and affect their ability to have a good relationship.
Hmm. Yes, because not everything is in our control. We are with other people who have their own behaviors and their own ways of dealing in their relationships. But what's in our control, probably more than anything, is how we manage ourselves, how we manage the emotions that come up, how we manage anger and sadness and fear, how we manage conflicts with other people. So we can learn techniques for example, not sending that angry email, but waiting until we calm down. Um, not jumping to a conclusion about why another person did what they did, but asking them. There are all kinds of techniques that we can use all by ourselves to help our relationships to go better. Now, that doesn't mean we can control what other people do or how they behave toward us, but there's a lot that we can do and a lot that we can model for other people.
I think we have time for one last question. Amy wants to know, do governments around the world notice the finding from your research? And are there any governments that are currently trying to use these to improve population well-being?
Mm. Amy, there's a really good report every year from the UN. It's a report on happiness, and you can find it online. And I encourage you to go find the one from, I think, 2019. I don't know if the 2020 report is out yet. But it talks about happiness around the world and the factors that promote happiness in different areas of the world. But your question about whether governments are noticing is important. Certain governments make well-being a priority. Bhutan, the Kingdom of Bhutan, was one of the first to do that about 20 years ago. The king of Bhutan decided that instead of just measuring well-being by means of gross national product, by economic growth, They needed to measure gross national happiness. So now in Bhutan, every time they propose a law in the legislature, they have to write out exactly what the implications are for the happiness of the population. So every law that's enacted has to take into account well-being of the population. Other countries are doing this as well. There's a minister for happiness in the United Arab Emirates. There's a minister for loneliness in the United Kingdom. Um, in our country, in the United States, the former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, made emotional well-being a core factor in his platform for public health. So there are governments that are trying to pay attention to this because we understand that just as we have grown economically and we've all gotten richer as a population, in many areas of the world, we have gotten less happy. And so we have to figure out what is it that will promote well-being in even the richest countries, because money doesn't buy us happiness. We're finding that at the global level.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was the last question. And please do like and subscribe our YouTube channel, Solve Happiness. And thank you so much, Robert, for giving us some pointers on how to live a good life and from your study.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.